Larry Cohen has become a mentor of mine over the years. I served with him on the Unity Reform Commission. He was the vice chair of the Unity Reform Commission, which we've talked about on the show, because it was the commission that decided to reform the party and the primary process that we are now living in today. He is the former president of the Communications Workers of America. He was a senior advisor to Bernie Sanders' campaign in 2016. He's the chair of Our Revolution. He's also a DNC member, and he's the lone Bernie supporter on the DNC's Rules Committee at the convention as of right now. Larry, thank you for joining the show. Hopefully a regular guest. A lot of rules were changed and updated and reformed in 2000 on the Unity Reform Commission that came out of the 2016 convention, and we're now sitting in what seems to be a very messy process. We saw what happened in Iowa. The caucuses are under fire right now. We don't know what's going to happen at the convention. How are you feeling about everything?
Sure. So we have a better process than 2016. Even in Iowa, with all the mess, at least there was a head count in all the caucuses, as opposed to just an awarding of delegates and no way to determine if it was accurate or not. Going forward, we have the actual elected delegates will control the nomination. I still believe it'll be a first ballot nomination. That's a huge improvement over 4 years ago, when the networks would flash up that Hillary Clinton had 500 and something non-elected so-called super delegates versus Sanders, with about 10. So, I actually think the process is better. It's a long road to democracy within the party. And actually, for me, within the 57 parties that make up the Democratic Party, they're legally separate entities. And, I say forward ever. We need to bring on democracy within and not just talk about voter suppression outside.
It's interesting you say that there are 57 separate legal entities, because I think, the media would have you believe, and there's a lot of misunderstanding of how the DNC functions, that the DNC can just tell every state what to do. But that's not true, right?
Right. Yeah, the only thing the DNC can do, which is, as you know, quite a laborious process, is to incentivize or penalize delegates every 4 years when the president is nominated. That's the only real leverage they have. Mm-hmm. They are awarding, some grants to state parties, so that's on the incentive side, for if certain tests are met. But basically, the 57 parties, 50 states, Washington, D.C., 5 territories, and Democrats abroad are totally autonomous. Some of them are quite democratic, mostly west of the Mississippi as well as northern New England. And some of them are notoriously undemocratic, led by New York, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and many of the others along the East Coast and South.
Yeah, and Illinois, not to forget.
And Illinois is getting better, actually, but we don't want to go too far into the weeds here.
Right,
Yes.
exactly. But it is interesting because, I think out of the Iowa caucus and going, into the Nevada caucuses as of this taping, the conversation is really about how broken the caucus system is, and I think you and I would both agree that there are a lot of ways that the caucus system could be improved, but it's not like primaries, all primaries are the same and they're that much better. And, we've talked about this before on the show, that there was a smear effort by some people who may not have the intentions of better democracy, saying that the Bernie side was trying to replace primaries with caucuses, which of course we didn't have the power to do so and was never on the table and never discussed. But with that being said,
never discussed would be the important phrase there.
Never discussed. With that being said, and also just to mention that we were in the minority, so we were suddenly so powerful in the minority of the commission, twisting
Right.
everybody's arms. But let's talk about the differences between primaries and caucuses, because I don't think a lot of people understand, how each of them function and what their pluses and minuses are.
Sure. So, on the downside of the primaries, for the most part, they're state-run primaries, so they're subject to state law. There are some positives in that in terms of a state election apparatus being there, but in many states, that apparatus is there to suppress voters.
Right.
And there's all kinds of restrictions about registration. New York is the worst, remains the worst on party registration. The deadline was yesterday to register for the April, as a Democrat, for the April 28th primary. And I don't know the updated count, but there were 3 million unaffiliated voters, mostly young, who, don't get any notice that if you didn't register as a Democrat by yesterday, you're not going to be able to vote in the primary once again.
Right.
Now, that's an improvement from 2016 when it was 6 months, but the Unity Reform Commission and the DNC said there must be same-day party switching. This is an example of the autonomy. New York said initially, too bad, and then under some pressure, several months ago, the governor agreed to support this 60-day, or a little more than 60-day rule. But yeah, there's lots of trade-offs here. There are examples of states, though, that have primaries where people can show up. Even New Hampshire, I put mostly in that category. There's other problems there, but they can show up, say, I'm joining the party, and I'm voting in the primary. That would be the gold standard, but probably about half the states are there and half are not. And then again, you have the issue of voter registration requirements and doing everything they can, states like Wisconsin, to purge the rolls.
Right. And in terms of caucuses, the arguments people make is they're not accessible, they're not democratic, they don't reflect, a diversity of voter base. We've heard all the different arguments.
Yeah.
What are the pros and cons of caucuses?
Well, so the pros, so first of all, there's only 4 left.
Right.
These 2 that are getting a lot of attention, Iowa and Nevada, and then Wyoming and the Virgin Islands, which is the last event in the nominating process on June 10th, but they have on June 6th, but they have 10 delegates and not a lot of attention there. The pros would be that, the Iowa caucus, the neighbors gather, they're all there together. They are spending more time. I'm not sure if that's a positive or not, but it's a lot more time. And it shows a deeper commitment. So you're getting closer to the more committed party members deciding how their 41 delegates would get elected. The obvious negative is people who are not physically able to vote or are working in the past couldn't participate at all. This year they had what I would call a not so great satellite caucus process where people could have a caucus in advance, say in a nursing home or at a workplace. And there were about 100 of those. And even in other countries, people had small caucuses. But again, we encouraged vote by mail for those people. They would have a simple affidavit about why they couldn't caucus. And they would have been able to, rank their choices, at least a couple of them. And that would have had a lot more accessibility. The access question that you mentioned is the big problem with caucuses.
And that's where the DNC, of course, without going down the rabbit hole of the app, but they essentially chose to implement this app to reveal the numbers that were not being transparently released to the campaigns or to the world, and also to set up the satellite caucuses within a certain structure. Like they basically strong-armed the Iowa State Party to do what they were pushing for.
Yes. It was the Rules Committee particularly, but the Rules Committee is heavily, is heavily dependent on the staff. Nobody can sit on a Rules Committee, even these political consultants that are on there, and know the details of 57 states and how they operate. So, what I would say again, it's way down in the weeds, but that number one, why did they need an app? While 1,780 or so caucuses sounds like a lot, we're talking about 1,780 pieces of paper that you take a photo of and email in, and then a team of people count the votes. So, on the one hand, I think there is a problem in not saying to people, listen, we have a caucus. We pride ourselves on that level of participation, but we're not going to have a count, especially for people on the East Coast. We're not going to have a count before you go to sleep. That's definitely going to be the case in Nevada. Anybody in New York who waits up for that count is going to be waiting for something that won't happen. But that's the nature of the caucus. It's a slow count. The last time where the precinct chairs just called in the delegate votes meant that you couldn't get a recount. Right. And there were many, many, many caucuses where they flipped the numbers around and all kinds of things, and you couldn't do anything about it. Well, that's not what democracy looks like either. So you're going to have a caucus, and who knows what will happen in 4 years now after this. But, it's not like transparency is a nuisance. Mm-hmm. There's got to be a paper backup for how the delegates get allotted or forget the caucus.
And then in states where, it's interesting because you mentioned New York State, and for those of you who aren't from New York is a Democratic state. It's the legislature is completely Democratic at this point. The governor controls the party. He decides who's a member of the party, representative to the DNC, I should say, from the party, unlike other states that might also be Democratic. But if you are in a state that's, say, Republican, right? Right. And you have a primary, the real concern there, as you mentioned with Wisconsin, is a different type of voter suppression. It may not be the voter suppression that the Democrats in New York have because they're all incumbents and don't want new people joining the party to vote in new people. But in a state like Wisconsin, it's very real voter suppression.
Yes, traditional voter suppression, which probably 20 or more states have some version of, including South Carolina, where it's difficult to vote. Yeah. And in Wisconsin's case, as you know, they purged tens of thousands of voters because they moved, or they didn't, some version of moving to a different address, which, again, no other democracy in the world operates like this. They don't have the registration anywhere else. You show up with a valid ID and you vote, and it's a paper ballot almost everywhere in the world. And again, it may take somewhat longer to count, but you have a backup as opposed to a machine, and people know or believe at least that there's a high level of transparency and validity.
Mm-hmm. So Larry, going into the convention, I think a lot of people they feel very left out in the dark about what could possibly happen. The process hasn't been very transparent, whether intentionally so or not. They're confused about the I'm confused about the superdelegate situation at this point, and I was in the room when we were voting on it. But what happens on the first ballot? What happens on the second ballot? What are these committees? I know you're on the Rules Committee for the convention. But you mentioned the Rules Committee and how it's made up of appointees of Tom Perez. Can you explain some of this stuff? Like pull back the curtain a little bit for folks who are curious?
Yeah, sure. So first of all, the easier one. The good news on the Rules Committee is there'll be 164 elected delegates named by their campaigns to the committee, proportional to the delegate strength of that candidate, after June 2nd. So the fact that the existing committees, obviously determined by the party chair and the executive committee of the party, I'm actually less concerned about that. I think that to go to your bigger question, if we don't have a first ballot nomination, and I'll talk in a minute about my sense of how we still can have that. Mm-hmm. On a second ballot, the non-elected delegates, the number fluctuates, but it's about 765. It's made up of all the DNC members plus all the Democrats in the House and the Senate. They have to be there themselves, plus the Democratic governors, plus about 15, former party officials like, President Obama. Mm-hmm. Only a couple are presidents. But anyway, that totals to about 765. And on a second, now they're delegates. So they vote on rules, they vote on credentials, they vote on the platform. They don't vote on the nomination of the president unless there is not a majority for a candidate on the first ballot. And when I say majority for a candidate, that's a candidate that is nominated during the nomination process right before the delegate vote. So all the elected delegates, some just under 4,000 elected delegates, all vote on the first ballot. But if their candidate is not nominated, meaning they dropped out and they're not nominated, those first ballot delegates, elected delegates, they can vote for anyone they want. Normally, they follow the lead of the candidate that got them elected. It's not like, they got elected because of their name or something.
Right.
So my belief is that there's still better than a 50% chance that that's what will happen. It's like a parliamentary democracy. Negotiations, you can call them deals, power trading will occur so that somebody gets to 1991. That's the magic number. If they don't, though, and obviously more than 2 delegates are nominated and nobody gets 1991, you then get this free-for-all where everybody becomes unpledged. And we jump the number who are voting by 760 on subsequent ballots.
So there would be a chance, I'm not saying this would happen, but if, say, Bernie came in with 1,985, right? And then we go to the second ballot. Hopefully that doesn't happen. If some of Bernie's delegates decided they didn't want to support him, they could go to the other candidate. I'm just trying to use that for an experiment. Okay.
Yeah, any delegate, it's in the charter of the party. You would have to actually change the charter, which is a more laborious process than what we worked on together, changing the rules and the call of the convention. Anyway, yes, it's in the charter that delegates can vote any way they want, except that elected delegates for the nomination of the president are bound to vote for the candidate, if nominated, to that candidate that got them elected.
Right.
So yes, on subsequent ballots, not only do you have the unpledged, automatic, non-elected, sometimes called super delegates pouring in, 765 or so of them, but you also have that the other 4,000 are now unpledged.
On the second ballot. So moving into the election, there's got to be a point where we know, right, that it's going to be potentially, whether Bernie wins the plurality or the number 1991 needed or not, we should have a sense, not unlike 2016. I mean, just to remind everybody, Hillary didn't have that number going into the election. They were counting the superdelegates that created this illusion of having hit that number until California.
Correct.
But this time around, say it's very close, is there going to be a point where we just know we're going into a brokered convention, and Bernie and whoever that candidate?
So initially, I wouldn't call it so much a brokered convention.
Okay.
I think the pressure should be on the nominees, the potential nominees, to negotiate with each other.
Yeah.
So that we don't have a second ballot with these 768 voting. So again, we made big strides, but as you know, we couldn't get them eliminated altogether. And this is what we ended up with. But the notion that candidates campaign for a year and a half, several $1 billion is spent without counting Bloomberg. There are 53 primaries and 4 caucuses, and somewhere around 40 million votes. And then we're going to go to a convention and have a free-for-all that includes 765 or so unelected delegates, in your scenario, determining the outcome. So to me, the pressure's got to be on from all sides to these candidates that get significant numbers of delegates, and there are thresholds further complicate this. If you don't get 15% in the district that the party has established as the district in that state, it's either a legislative or congressional district, you get no delegates. But in any case, the candidates that get delegates, pressure should be on them to negotiate some kind of power sharing agreement to get to 1991, in my opinion, much better than a free-for-all on a second, third, or more round of balloting in order to get somebody to the new number, which would be around 2,400.
Right, with the superdelegates added.
Yeah.
It's a lot to take in.
Aren't you glad you asked me all these detailed questions?
I am. You know what? Everyone's asking me, and I'm like, I know some of it. I don't know all of it. So I'm glad that we have the encyclopedia here. You are on that rules committee. You're a lone voice. When you look at the rules committee, it would be irresponsible for me not to point out how many folks on that committee that were appointed, not elected, are people in the industry of elections, in the industry of lobbying, in the industry of foreign military whatever that complex is. These are people who are consultants and lobbyists, and they have a more power than elected DNC members. In the case of California right now, people are running across the state for DNC membership, and the elected members don't get put on these committees. So what do you think the experience is going to be like going onto the Rules Committee at the convention with these folks that you've run up against many times? I shouldn't say this is the first time you've gone through it.
Yeah, well, as I said, I'm counting on the 164 elected delegates that will join each of these committees,
right.
Rules, Platform, and Credentials, and to build alliances and, to speak clearly that these rules are going to be democratic there's no war. They're going to be democratic. They're going to be better than they've been in the past. Mm-hmm. And, the voice of the people who have participated in this somewhat tortuous year and a half of campaigning is going to be the voice that's heard. So I am optimistic that we can get that done. Mm-hmm. And even if I'm the only one out of those 25 or so, I'm going to have a lot of company based on the way these primaries and caucuses are going, and we will be a majority.
Just like last time. So just final words, because I think this is really important. I mean, you've done so much organizing. Most of your experience really has been on the movement side and organizing workers and pushing for progressive change, especially when it comes to economic issues. So for the movement, in the next 6-7 months as we approach the convention and beyond, what are some pieces of advice you could give us that we can learn from 2016 in particular, going into this very heated election?
Well, I think it's, first of all, to stay focused on the issues that motivated us to get involved in the first place, whether that's, a decent healthcare system, for me, Medicare for all, that would put us where every other democracy is. Not only the moral reasons, but the economic ones, the gigantic waste of hundreds of billions of dollars a year for profit insurance companies and pharmaceuticals, while we leave out millions of people, right. The worst of both worlds. Or whether it's, racial and gender justice, that we stay focused on, dozens of issues, right? But that we stay focused on the issues that would make us each happier. Mm-hmm. They're not going to be the same for all of us. And that's the only purpose of political involvement. I'm very devoted to Bernie Sanders, for example, but that devotion is about the change that I spent, my life fighting for, workers' rights at the front of that parade for me. And, we're at the bottom of every democracy on workers' rights. Right. So, I think we have to stay focused on issues. We have to realize that change, like it or not, in this most complicated 18th century democracy means the states, the House, the Senate, the courts, it's all lined up against us. One day we're going to have to deal with that when we have built a movement of what I say 50 million people ready to fight for change. But in the meantime, those are the rules we have. And we've got to stay focused no matter who's elected to say, wait a minute, we're here for the change. We're going to fight for the change. We'll go in the streets for the change. And we're not going to give up on that change. That's what our lives, our children, our happiness are all about, is that change. It's not a foot race. It's not a track event about who finishes first. It's about how do we get the change that we believe in and the change that should be within reach.
Larry, beautiful words. Always so great at motivating us in the end. Thank you for joining the Nomiki Show, and I look forward to hopefully seeing you at the convention, following your leadership at the convention, because you always know what's going to happen.
I don't know about that. We'll follow each other.
You're pretty good at it. I'm very, very grateful to you for all of your work and commitment and leadership, and thanks for joining the show.
Okay, my pleasure. Thank you.
Thanks.